Thank you. Thank you, Fiona. We're actually really lucky to have Joachim Clement here. He is based in Europe, so it is very, very early in the morning for him. So thank you so much for joining us at this time. Joachim is the Managing Director, Research Analyst, Strategy, Economics and ESG at Panmure Liberum. And he will be joining us to build on top of my technical speak about what's expected in the disclosures and to give you some insights in terms of what our investors looking for, particularly around organizations' strategy. And Joachim, one of the questions that we had earlier was around how organizations should balance climate-related risks that have been identified with business-related risks and business-related strategy. So it'd be great to get your insights into that as well. But before
Excellent.
we turn to get to those insights, let me do the little overview of where strategy fits in the disclosures. So you've seen this now a couple of times. Strategy is the last one that we're talking about. And the purpose of the strategy disclosures under the AASB is for users of general purpose financial reports to understand the entity's strategy for managing climate-related risks and opportunities. And the specific things that are expected to be disclosed here are on this slide, and there's actually a double click under each of the ones on the left-hand side. So an entity is expected to disclose the effects of climate change and also the inputs that it's used to develop its strategies. So the effects that it's expected to disclose are the impact of those climate-related risks and opportunities on the entity's business model and value chain, on the entity's strategy and decision-making, and on the entity's financial position, financial performance, and cash flows for the reporting period in the short, medium, and long term. And the entity is supposed to define what those different timeframes are, and they should reflect the same timeframes that they use in their financial reporting. So there's a little bit of an understanding of what needs to go into the strategy disclosures, but Joachim, it'd be great to hear from you in terms of what are investors looking for when they look at an entity's strategy to manage climate-related risks and opportunities, and what are some of the red or green flags that they see in those declared disclosures?
Well, thank you very much, Amanda, and thanks everyone for having me. It's my pleasure, actually, even though it's a little bit early here. I'm in Germany at the moment, so I'm just 10 hours behind you. That's fine. When it comes to strategy and how a company develops its strategy, I think, and I would say if you ask 10 different ESG investors, you get 12 different answers of what they're looking for. So take everything I say with a little bit of a grain of salt in the sense that it is my personal preferences. And my number one goal when assessing a strategy is how is that going to be implemented in the business? Is it just a paper tiger, so to say? Because one of the most common red flags that I see with companies when they are developing a strategy for their transition plan is that they put in place a governance structure, but then forget about all the concrete stuff that needs to be done in order to get it working in real life and actually transform the business. So to give you an example, there might be a good governance structure there, but there is a lack of incentives for the people involved to actually do the work. And that usually goes all the way to the top. Here in Europe, we are in a very unfortunate position at the moment where we are starting to see some companies, most notably just yesterday, BP, British Petroleum, announced that they will dial back their ESG efforts and investments in renewable energy and focus more on being a low-cost provider of traditional oil and gas. And as part of that, they've also removed some of the incentives for the CEO and top-level management in order to move their transition forward towards net zero. So that's kind of the situation that we're in Europe, where some companies are feeling the pressure to dial back some of their strategy. But in general, I would say, look in particular that on the link between strategy and actual implementation. And the green flags is a good incentive structure across the entire organization, not just with the CEO and the CFO, but to have named people across the organization that will drive the transition and the strategy into the daily operations of the company. And that brings me to the second, and for every red flag, there's a green flag. So I'm kind of using these things interchangeably, because if you don't have it, it's a red flag. If you do have it, it's a green flag. And that is, do you have the resources? There's in my professional life, I've worked mostly with smaller and medium-sized companies, and there's a big talking gap in large cap organizations that is ironically the opposite of what we see in small and medium-sized operations. In large operations in Europe, we tend to see companies talking a big game. But if you then dig deeper, and it's like, okay, so do you have the money involved to implement that strategy? Do you have the expertise? If you don't have the expertise, how do you think you're going to upskill your own people, or do you want to outsource expertise and get experts from outside, like Fair Supply? And then there's often a blank stare. It's like, we haven't looked that far. And then if I talk to smaller and medium-sized enterprises, it's often the opposite. They're like, we don't know how to communicate these things, but we're doing them already. And the reason why they're doing it already is because actually implementing a lot of these things, and that goes to what you said, Amanda, in the beginning about the question. It was asked, balancing business goals with climate-related goals. Especially for a lot of the companies that we have in Europe that are not in the mining sector or in the energy sector, they often go hand in hand, because reducing your greenhouse gas emissions effectively means, for many of them, improving the productivity of their operations, having more energy efficiency, using less energy in their operations, for example, in their factories and warehouses. And in Europe, we have some of the highest energy costs in the world. So actually accelerating your transition plan means your energy bill goes down, your costs go down quite substantially. So that's a nice thing, nice position to be in. So I would say that's kind of, don't want to be too long, but I would say the key factors that we look at, or that I focus on, is the bridge between what you say on paper your goals are, and your plan is to get there, to how can you drive that throughout the organization? Do you have the skills necessary? Do you have the money necessary? How are you going, who and how is this going to work its way through the organization? And what happens if there are things that slip up? Because every transition, no transition is smooth. Forget about it. It will never happen. Everything happens with some hiccups and some setbacks. But are there incentives in place that people actually then kind of feel the pain and have a incentive to correct things when they went wrong? Or can they just let it slip and you're just kind of gradually falling more and more behind your strategy that you originally set out maybe 2-3 years ago, and then 5-10 years ago, depending on when you started?
Joachim, we have a question from one of our participants on those incentives, both the positive and the negative incentives, which I think you're referring to. Do you have ideas on what those incentives could look like other than just bonuses? So are there other incentives, financially or non-financially, that you've seen work well to make sure that the plans do get executed, and that if things are off track, they get rectified?
So I would say the financial incentive that works best, and actually tends to work better than bonuses or executive scorecards, is sustainability-linked loans and bonds, where reaching certain milestones or keeping within certain decarbonization targets directly translates into higher or lower cost of debt for a company. You wouldn't believe how much of a miracle that can be, even if we're talking here typically about 5 basis points lower cost of debt. We live in a world where interest rates have gone up quite a bit from where we were just 2 or 3 years ago. So every basis point counts. So that's really one of the best signaling tools when companies commit to either issuing green bonds or sustainability-linked bonds to actively translate their goals into a financial incentive on the cost of debt side.
And that, in my amateur understanding of how they work, speaks to incentivizing the business, not necessarily individuals in the business. So that might be where we start to find that intersection between climate-related risks and business-related risks. So while more coal being mined is great from a business opportunity, if the ability for an organization to get green finance is tied to no coal being mined, then that might be a way that we can sort of reconcile or balance those two things out.
Absolutely. And while a green bond or sustainability linked bond or incentives like that might not be linked to a person directly, trust me, the CFO will really look at that number. So you're more or less directly linking it to the CFO.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. And maybe the next thing I'm going to talk about in disclosures is around climate resilience. How do you, as an investor, judge the climate resilience of an organization, and what are the kind of things that give you confidence that an entity has robust climate resilience?
So this is the bit where, for us as outsiders and as investors, it becomes really, really difficult because number one, we have to rely on what the company tells us. We often, as outsiders, have no way of going into the nitty-gritty detail of what is going on in a company in terms of climate resilience. And that's where the scenario planning and the scenario analysis becomes really, really important for us as investors, because it gives us an idea of the sensitivities around some of those plans. What I typically appreciate is if, number one, those scenarios are linked to the shared socioeconomic pathways in climate plans. Because that gives me a common denominator around which to compare one company to another. It doesn't really help me if one company says, okay, we're modeling sea change because, you know, and the next company is like, oh, we're modeling droughts. It's like, it's important to model droughts if you're in the food business or if you are very water intensive in your operations. But if you are an industrial company that isn't very water intensive, modeling droughts doesn't really do anything. And if I see a company like that model droughts, but not sea level change, even though it has factories close to the shore, I'm starting to think like, okay, what are you trying to hide here? Are you just showing us the stuff that really looks good, and all the complicated stuff you've either kind of push that to the far end and like, we'll get there when we get there. That's the kind of thing. So I am, just like with greenhouse gas emissions, and obviously you've got a session on metrics and targets, I want to have a common denominator that allows me to compare different businesses on a kind of a common scale. And that's why I like scenario plans that are derived from the SSPs in that respect.
Right. Well, stay tuned, because we're about to do an exercise on scenario planning. So you can give us a mark at the end of how well we've done in terms of if you are investing in our hypothetical company. So thank you very much for those insights. I'm now going to jump back into getting to the specifics of the reporting standards and scenario planning. And then, Joachim, we'd love to hear from you towards the end, again, around climate transition plans. Thank you. Okay, so get our head back into what the standards are expecting of us in terms of climate resilience. So Joachim spoke a little bit about that and how he assesses that as an investor. This is what the standards expect. This is what the standards are looking for around climate resilience. They define that as the resilience of the entity's strategy and business model to climate-related changes, developments, and uncertainties, taking into consideration those climate-related risks and opportunities that we identified. And it should use a climate-related scenario to assess that climate resilience using an approach that is commensurate with the entity's circumstances. So this, I think, is what you were referring to, Joachim, there in terms of if you're doing a drought modelling, but you don't have any agriculture inputs to your business model, that's probably not commensurate with your entity's circumstances. And in that climate resilience, in the disclosures around climate resilience, an entity is required to talk a little about its current climate resilience. So the implications of the assessment that it's done, where there were significant areas of uncertainty in that assessment, and the entity's capacity for adaptation. It also needs to share some information about the scenario analysis that it did undertake. So to give the details to the investors or the users of general purpose financial reports, how and when that analysis was undertaken, what was the information that was included, and what are the key assumptions. Now, the standards do have some concessions for organisations in terms of doing or reporting on their climate resilience, but they are very specific around not having the capability or where the climate resilience can't be sufficiently identified from the overall business resilience. However, an entity must explain why they are not able to do that. So you can't just opt out of it without giving a justification. So that's what's expected around climate resilience. If we double click again, we go into the scenario analysis. So let's have a look at what is expected to be included in the scenario analysis, and then we'll help our friends out at Acme Mining Machinery and run a very brief scenario analysis for them. So what's expected in the disclosures is around inputs and assumptions. So what were the inputs to the scenario analysis and what were the assumptions that were made? So those inputs include the climate scenarios that were used and the source. So that would be like Joachim was saying, the SSP. Are you looking at publicly available global best science on those different scenarios? Was a diverse range of scenarios included? Did those scenarios include both physical and transition risk? Were they based on the latest international agreement on climate change? And right now, that's the Paris Agreement, which I think Anna would have spoken to you about yesterday. Why were those scenarios deemed relevant? Why did you choose to look at drought when you're at sea level, for example? What were the time horizons used and what were the scope of your operations included in that scenario analysis? And then the assumptions that need to be included are what were the climate-related policies in each jurisdiction? There are different climate-related policies in Europe, in Australia, in the US. So how did you think about them? What macroeconomic trends were assumed? What national and regional variables were assumed? Far North Queensland is very different from Tasmania. How did you take that into account? What energy use and mix was assumed? And what developments in technology were assumed? And across all of that needs to be included the reporting period in which the analysis was carried out. So that's what's expected in the scenario analysis. A little bit of context for you as you move into thinking or getting your head around scenario analysis. I've looked at it from a very dry point of view in terms of what's required in the standards. The TCFD actually has some guidance. I've popped here the one for non-financial companies around why would you do a scenario analysis. So there is the reason you do it because the standards are going to require you to, or your investors are starting to look at that. But the TCFD helps to think about that. These help an organization. This is actually helps the organization to understand how those physical and transition related risks and opportunities around climate change might actually develop. And they might develop in different ways and how the business might be impacted. So it's really a sort of a mental exercise, if you like. The important thing to note is that it's a hypothetical construct and it's not a forecast or prediction. So your organization is not committing to a particular eventuality, but you are taking the information in the different scenarios to understand how that's likely to impact your business. It can be really useful with the leadership in terms of challenging conventional thinking about the future. So that hypothetical discussion about why reduced royalties is a really good thing for the business, and how that might be offset by the fact that there's more coal out there being burnt. And it gives you the sort of the premise for exploring different ideas. So instead of being constrained to the current business strategy planning processes, it allows everyone to kind of put a different colored hat on and start thinking about how things might be done differently. So next question is, what are the steps that we should do to undertake a scenario analysis? And I've simplified this down to 5 steps, and then we'll have a go at practicing some of them for ACME. So the first one there is to identify and engage the key stakeholders. Now, so a lot of the work that is done on climate-related reporting sits in the sustainability team or an ESG team, and it's relatively self-contained. Scenario planning is much more effective if it's picking up a broad range of stakeholders within the organisation, and it's most effective when it has leadership buy-in and engagement, particularly the CFO, the people who are actually going to be the ones who are making decisions about any strategy changes that need to be made. If you can get their engagement and buy-in at the very beginning, then your scenario analysis and strategy process is likely to be much more successful. So once they've been identified and engaged, the second step is to define the scope of the scenario analysis. So which business units are in scope, which assets, which locations, what time horizons are we going to look at, and how many scenarios are we going to look at? Now, the standards expect that every entity will run at least 2 scenarios, and those scenarios are caught up in, if you follow the logic up through all the acts, that would be at least a 1.5 degree scenario and one that is 2 degrees or higher. There's nothing stopping you doing more scenarios. So it can be really helpful to understand, based on your industry and the likely things that are going to happen in your industry because of climate change, there might be different temperature scenarios that you run. Once you've chosen those scenarios, it's then time to actually run it. And this is often done as a workshop where you have those key stakeholders in the room, sort of playing around with if this, then that, if this, then that, and bringing that together to understand what potential outcomes there might be. And the final step is then connecting back into the entity's overall strategy development process and adjusting the strategy where needed based on those results. So relatively simple to explain, those 5 steps. I do understand they're not quite that simple to execute in an organisation, particularly an organisation which is not quite ready or have got their head around climate-related disclosures. So let's help our friends at ACME Mining Machinery out and do a really rough one. And again, this is not good enough for an investor, but it gives you an idea of the steps that we might undertake to do a scenario analysis. And what we're looking at here is information, 2 charts from the IPCC 6 assessment report. This is a report that was pulled together by the Weather and Climate Extreme Events in a Climate Changing, the working group around weather and climate extreme events in a changing climate. And that's the global maps. I know they are very hard to read, so let's go and have a look at the Australian. I've zoomed in on the Australian maps. Joachim, just for your benefit, we're looking at a company that is in Queensland, based kind of mid-north and far north Queensland. So they exist here. Sorry. And now if we have a look at these charts are giving us information, the left-hand side is telling us the projected changes in frequency of extreme temperature events at different temperature scenarios. The right-hand one is telling us the projected changes in frequency of extreme precipitation events. And the way that you read each of these, and let's use the North Australian one because that's going to be where Rockhampton and Townsville sit. These orange, each of these bars is telling us information about each of these temperature scenarios. So the first one is a 1 degree rise, the second one 1.5, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, and 4 degrees. And the orange bar represents the increased frequency, or the frequency of what we would call a 1 in 50-year event. And the purple bar represents an increased frequency of a 10-year event. And the dark line in the middle is sort of where the scientists projected it would land. And the broad orange bars in this case around it are saying where the uncertainty sits. So if we look at a 2 degree scenario in Northern Australia for a 50-year event, so that's this orange one here, the projection is that it's going to be somewhere around, let's say that's 20. So we're going to have a 1 in 50-year event 20 times more frequently. but the uncertainty is quite large. So it could be as high as 35 or it could be as low as 14. I can't quite read the graph. Either way, that's a pretty big increase on today. So that's what's happening on extreme temperature events in Northern Australia. Over in Northern Australia, increased frequency of extreme precipitation events, not quite so dramatically high until we get to the 4 degrees scenario here. So from that information, as the people who are carrying out the scenario analysis, we've got some idea of increased temperature and we've got some idea of increased precipitation, and we can kind of overlay that with the locations of our operations. The second piece of data that I've also taken from that same report, which tells us very similar things, but it gives us an understanding of the uncertainty that the scientists have in pulling together those scenarios. So this one I've popped up here is giving additional text to those extreme temperature events. And the colours in the boxes reflect the certainty or the confidence that the scientists have in the declarations that are made in here. And so what we can see from this colour scale here is all the text that's in this box is very likely to happen. All the text that is in this red box is extremely likely to happen. And all the text that is in this box is virtually certain to happen. So from a scenario planning, if we were running a scenario at 4 degrees from an extreme temperature event one, we would have to really use the data in here. If we have a look at the same information for the extreme precipitation events, you get a sense here that there's less confidence about the scenario, the outputs or the impacts of each of these scenarios. So in this case, the grey text represents there's low confidence in what the scientists have come up with. We don't yet have enough data to feel confident about it. By the time we get to the 2 degree projection, there's medium confidence. And by the time we're over here at the 4 degree projection, we think that's likely. So again, that's some information that is taken from the IPCC reports. See, I have a question, so let me see if I can open that one. Yes, the question is are the IPCC scenarios publicly available? Absolutely, and I've given you the links here. I've also only picked from some of the reports. I haven't even talked to the SSPs that Joachim was talking about because there's an additional level of complexity in understanding what they are. But yes, all of this is publicly available, and in fact, all the things that I'm presenting to you are publicly available. So that gives you an understanding of some initial resources that you have. The next resource that I'm using here is taken from a site which is called the Coastal Risk Screening Tool. And so, Joachim, our Acme mining machinery has 3 locations, 2 of which are very close to the coast at the moment. And so this information for rising sea levels is going to help us assess whether they are likely to still be very close to the coast at different temperature scenarios, whether they will be underwater by that stage. So I've got 3 different charts here. This first one is, sorry, let me explain. The light blue colour represents the expected sea level at 2 degrees warming, and the red colour represents the expected sea level at 4 degrees warming. No, that's hard to see, so we'll try and zoom that up. This is what Townsville, which is where our hypothetical distribution centre is. This is what Townsville's coastline looks like at 2 degrees, that blue one. And you add the red in, that's at 4 degrees. And it's a bit difficult to see under the blues, but this is where Townsville's current coastline is. So as you can see, it's low lying, that's a river basin, so it's quite low lying at the point where even when we're at a 2 degree warming. If we have a look at Rockhampton, it's even more stark. Rockhampton at the moment is 30 k's away from the coast, which is out here somewhere. If we hit 2 degrees, pretty much Rockhampton becomes a coastal city. If we hit 4 degrees, Rockhampton pretty much ceases to exist. So from a climate change point of view, rising sea levels is something that we should consider because we know our operational locations are close to the coast. And this again is publicly available data. It helps us play out that scenario. And our final location is the Brisbane CBD. It also has some impact from sea level rises. Most notably, the airport has gone underwater at 2 degrees, but our operation is in the CBD here somewhere, so potentially not likely to be too impacted by the time we get to 4 degrees. So now, with all that information, and again, I know it's very brief, and it's not rigorous enough to keep an investor happy. But based on that information from those publicly available data sources on this scenario, we'll head over to the Mentimeter again and have a look at which risks are likely to be material for Acme. And this time we're going to look in that medium to long term. So the first one is that increased number of high temperature days in Northern Australia reduces the tonnage of iron ore and coal extracted due to work stoppages. So again, work health and safety regulations in Australia. Potentially people will have to stop working in the mining industry at certain temperatures, and therefore the output will probably come down. The second one is the increased frequency of extreme weather events and increased precipitation in Northern Australia cuts roads to Townsville more often, and therefore less distribution can take place. Third one is increased bushfire activity destroys the Brisbane head office. Fourth one, rising sea levels mean that the manufacturing facility in Rockhampton will have a limited asset life. And the last one is increased water scarcity means that ACME's water bills will increase dramatically. So again, all those risks may or may materialize, but we want to understand which ones we think are likely to be most material in the definition of material that we talked at the beginning. So let's pop over and move to that slide. Hopefully that gives us some information in terms of the future looking scenarios. Which risks do we think are likely to be material? Hopefully that still works for you guys to pick some choices. Yep, here they come. Got a few. And again, you can pick more than one. We're not asking you to pick just one or the highest one. It's really just to give a chance to engage in the information that we've had a look at. Here they come. Yeah, we got a pretty good spread. I don't think anyone's too worried about bushfires and the Brisbane head office, which of course doesn't mean that they won't happen. But for the long-term operations, the risks that are happening at the manufacturing site and the distribution centre are probably more likely to be material. Great. Thanks, guys. Thanks for that participation. So now we've got a bit of an understanding, again, very top level understanding of which risks are likely to be material. It's time to start thinking about what would we do about that. So what are some of the strategy adjustments that we could make, or ACME could make, sorry, in order to manage the likelihood of those risks materializing and therefore build ACME's long-term climate resilience. So I've got 5 options here, but I'd also really love some options in the chat. Again, I can only fit a few options on the page. So we'll do the quiz on these 5 options, but if you can think of some others, please add them into the chat. The whole idea of scenario planning is bringing in all the resources that you have at your disposals to take this information and turn it into potential strategies or changes that can be made to build climate resilience. So the first option here is undertake a feasibility assessment for using recycled steel in ACME's production processes. So less reliance on virgin iron ore and more reliance on steel that's already out there. Second one is establish a business continuity plan, which includes actions for workers, ACME's workers, to take on extreme heat days. The third one, carry out a feasibility study to relocate ACME's manufacturing facility and distribution centre away from the coast. The fourth one, introduce an on-site food waste digester in the Brisbane head office. And the last one, expand its product offering to support a broader range of mining operations and not just coal. So let's have a look. We'll go over to this one, to our slide. Again, you should be able to pick more than one answer. We're not just going to pick one strategy. When we're doing our climate-related disclosures, we want to think through all the strategies that might help to address climate-related opportunities as well as business opportunities as well. So we've got some answers coming in. And again, please feel free to pop some other ideas into the chat. It looks like we're clustering around the feasibility study to relocate ACME's manufacturing facility and distribution centre away from the coast. And because we're talking long term, we should have enough time to be able to do that. And based on the sea level rise projections, that seems like it would be a pretty wise option because eventually those facilities are probably going to be underwater. But again, it is in the long term. A business continuity plan, which includes actions for ACME's workers to take on extreme heat days, obviously would be super valuable, but it's not necessarily going to have an impact on those risks that we've presented. It might mean that the manufacturing facility or the distribution centre needs to shut down, but those are things that the organisation ACME itself can control. A feasibility assessment for using recycled steel. rather than virgin steel would be helpful from a business opportunity point of view, because it reduces the reliance on virgin steel, which has come from virgin iron ore. And if the production drops, and coal, if the production of both of those commodities drop, then that's going to have an impact. And expanding its product offering to support a broader range of mining operations, not just coal, is building on the information that we heard in the first session around risk management, which is if the world is to transition to a low carbon economy, it's reasonable to expect that there will be reduced output from the coal industry. So for the long term, ACME probably needs to start creating machinery that can be used in other operations rather than just coal mining. And the last one there, an on-site food waste digester in the Brisbane head office would be great to do. It's not a bad thing, but in terms of material action, it's probably not going to move the needle for ACME's long-term business health. It'll make everyone feel good that they're in the head office, feel that they are making a contribution, but it won't necessarily help with those long-term climate resilience. So not a bad idea, probably not the first one that you would choose to do. Great. Let me pause there and see if there are any questions in terms of those strategy adjustments or other ideas that you have around strategies that could be implemented by ACME based on the very limited knowledge that we have. Wonderful. It looks like we have one. Jennifer is suggesting alternative distribution option via ships out of Townsville. Yep, that would be one scenario. Hoping that the port infrastructure is still above sea level, although you would assume, or you might rely on the government to do something about that, so that if the port infrastructure goes below sea level, hopefully the Queensland government or the port operator would do something about that. So you are making assumptions there, which you would have to declare as well. It's great. Thanks, Jennifer. Any other thoughts on some strategy adjustments that we might make? Oh, wonderful. And then the next slide I've popped in here is just to give you some of insight into some of those resources that I've used here. There are many more publicly available resources out there, particularly in the IPCC reports. I talked to this one. There is an Australasia specific one in a different report, so that gives you more insights into what's expected in Australasia. The Climate Council has that climate risk map of Australia. They've also just published a heat map for Australia, the coastal risk screening tool, and the climate valuation. So there's some things. Again, if you guys have also if you've come across other publicly available information that will be useful for everyone, please pop that into the chat as well. And I'm going to wrap up so that we can give Joachim a bit of time to share the rest of his insights. These are the things that are needed to be included in the climate-related disclosures around strategy. The two inputs here, we spoke to scenario analysis. There's also a climate-related transition plan. And there's some particular things that need to be included in that climate-related transition plan. And this is how it's defined in the standard. It is an aspect of an entity's overall strategy that lays out the entity's targets, actions, or resources for its transition towards a lower carbon economy, including actions such as reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. So the climate-related transition plan, according to the standards, should include information about the targets. What are the emission reduction targets? How will resources be allocated? The timeframe that it applies to, and also what actions will be delivered. And Joachim, that sounds like some of the same things that you were talking about earlier in terms of what you look for in an organization. But I wonder if you can share some more insights into what you look for in that climate-related transition plan. And when you've looked through multiple organizations, have you seen examples of where incorporation of the scenario planning or the climate-related risks and opportunities has helped an organization to uncover opportunities that they might not have uncovered otherwise?
Yes, absolutely. And by the way, I really like that kind of sample of Acme Mining Equipment Corporation because it really covers all the bases. From an investor perspective, I would just add one thing, and totally understandable that in this little example, you couldn't do all that stuff. But we investors all have a black belt in Excel spreadsheets. So as a result, we are looking for numbers. Yeah. So when you do your scenario analysis, when you do your sensitivity analysis, so to say, in different scenarios, we are always grateful if a company puts numbers to these risks. Yes, even if you say it's likely or highly likely, we all know that we have a limited ability to assess the probability of an event happening, of the manufacturing site going underwater, etc. But to at least try to understand what would be the financial damage in today's dollars if that were to happen. And that brings me to what I call not just the gold standard, but I like to call it the platinum standard. The best thing I've ever seen anywhere in the world is when you go to those French luxury companies like Kering, the owner of Gucci, or LVMH of Louis Vuitton fame, they have always been trailblazers in these kinds of transition plans and scenario analysis. And Kering in particular has gone as far as to develop an environmental profit and loss, environmental P&L. That is the stuff that you normally find in government environmental agencies, where they spend 10 or 20 years developing that stuff. Because Kering and LVMH were at the forefront in 2014, a year before the Paris Climate Accord, they now have that for 10 years. And what that has, for example, done for them is to show that the biggest bang for the buck is when you focus on leather production. Because leather production comes from cows, usually farmed in South America, Argentina or Brazil. And originally they found out, obviously, that some of those farming lands are in deforested Amazon rainforest, so good luck with that. But they basically could find that by putting numbers in that and putting numbers to these scenarios, that if they focus on reducing the environmental impact of their leather production or using less leather, that would have the biggest impact on their environmental footprint and on their greenhouse gas emissions. Now, having a full-on environmental P&L is way beyond the scope for 99.9% of all businesses. But I would use them as an inspiration. I always recommend them as an inspiration of what you can do in individual companies yourself. You can kind of dress it up as an environmental P&L, so to say, your scenario analysis. And when you do a workshop and say, like, you know, if we do this, how much would that save us? What would be the impact financially, etc. And that gives huge boost of confidence to investors that you're actually serious about that and that you've thought that through.
Great, thank you. Now you've got some slides here. Would you like me to pop them up so that you can talk through
let's
them?
do that.
That's great.
Let's do that quickly. I'm not going to go through all of them because we've touched on some of them already. So if you go to the next slide, that is just a survey that I found from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development of what companies are working on when they're looking on their transition plans. And that is a survey of about 50 companies, mostly in Europe and North America. And what I find interesting there is that the vast majority are in what I call the paper stage, the planning stage and developing stage, because it's a very new topic. Not too many companies, only about 16% are actively working on accelerating the development of low carbon products and services, which is to me kind of like the implementation stage. So if you think that we're only just beginning, you and everybody else, so don't worry about that. If you go to the next slide, that's what I mentioned a little bit in the first block of answers. Have a layout of all the tasks that you need to do in order to implement your strategy. Put it to work. And as part of that, I was trained as a physicist originally, and my thesis supervisor says there's the invariance of difficulty. in the sense that if you think you found a simple way to kind of get rid of your problem, it's just because you haven't figured out the difficulties that are further down the line. So there's often an approach of picking the low-hanging fruit. And when it comes to picking the low-hanging fruit, I have nothing against that, as long as you are also thinking about how do I do the difficult stuff. Because there's nothing worse than kind of doing all the simple stuff first and then finding out that the actual big task at the end, you get to that and you have no idea how to solve that. Then all the work you've done in the years beforehand was for nothing. So do a proper strategy in the sense of also including the resources that you need, and think about the resources you need. As I said, upskilling internally, getting outside help, having the money available to pay for that, because otherwise you're going to get stuck at some point, and then it becomes really hard, because you might get a massive delay, or you might have to abandon your plan altogether. If we go to the next one, that's just about incentives. And one thing that I want to emphasize here is, for every business, be aware that I would say the vast majority of your work is outside of your company. For the vast majority of companies that I work with, the greenhouse gas emissions are scope-free, which means you have to engage with your suppliers, with your customers, and you have to be regularly in touch with them. It's not just the simple, quotation mark, simple stuff where it's within your factory gates and you can just kind of order people to work on that project. Kind of getting your suppliers, customers, etc. on board is a really important task, and staying with them all the time in a constant feedback loop is incredibly important, and probably more important than what you do internally. Next one, please. Greenwashing, we've already touched on that. And then if you go to the last slide, again, this is where I have to emphasize I'm trained as a physicist, and as such in complex system dynamics. And this is something where I think a lot of business leaders still think very much in linear terms. It's this kind of like, if I do this, then I can just order the organization, put the right people in place, and then drive it through the organization. And drive it top down from headquarters out to all the different locations that we're running. That is the traditional way of doing it, and it is almost always a bad way of coming up with a transition plan or with a good strategy. It is usually much better to decentralize the decision making as much as possible, because the people in different countries, especially if it's a multinational organization, know much better what's happening on the ground and what they can do to improve their resilience. And so always delegate to the lowest level of responsibility possible, and ensure that this low level has the right inputs and the right feedback from customers, from suppliers across the entire supply chain, to make the right decisions at the right time, and then give them the freedom to experiment. I've got one client that I unfortunately can't name, but they have done this really well, where they basically have given different teams in different of their manufacturing sites free rein to, like, you do what you think is right for you, and then after a year we check, and then after again every year we check, and they use that as kind of different playgrounds and different experimental settings, and what worked in one location they rolled out to other locations. And this way you can get much quicker solutions that you can't think of if you just have a workshop of the executive board or your climate specialists within your companies on an afternoon or in a day in headquarters. Because when the rubber hits the road, a lot of things might just kind of pop up that are opportunities to get quick wins that cost you nothing.
And so these paying attention to who those stakeholders are in your climate journey. They're not necessarily the typical stakeholders that you're used to working with. They might be in all different places in the organization.
Absolutely. It's often the guy who runs the warehouse who knows where things are, or sometimes it's the machinist who runs a machine and thinks about like, oh, this is how we could reduce some of the waste that we use, or do we really have to kind of, keep the computers running all night? Or should we just kind of shut them down at 9 o'clock in the evening, and then the next day at 7 o'clock or whenever people come into work, we just kind of let them set up in the morning, and voila, we've just saved 5% of our electricity bill in our office.
Amazing. Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights. I think that was your last slide, right? So we're nearly done. I'm about to wrap up and kind of close out the strategy session, but I think it would be great, if you don't mind, Joachim, if we just ask if any of our participants have other questions for you while you're still here, to make it worth your while being up this early in the morning. So are there any questions? If someone wants to drop a question in the chat for Joachim before we let him go. Oh, yep, we have got one. It takes a while for it to get typed in, I think. Yeah, or you could put your hand up, and we will we will unmute for those questions to come through. While you're thinking if there are any more questions, I thought what I would do is I've created this really quick, I call it climate disclosure checklist. This is not, obviously the standards and the legislation are what you should rely on before you do your climate disclosures. But I thought these questions might be helpful for helping you get started on that journey. And if you are able, do the work that it takes you to be able to answer these questions within your organization should help you get all the information that you need to include in your climate disclosures. I won't go through them in detail. I believe we're sharing the slides with everyone, but this is trying to simplify it down to, if you can answer these questions, you should be in a good position to be able to carry out or implement your climate-related financial disclosures. So check. No more questions? Any more questions for Joachim? I think you've probably done such a good job that you have answered. Oh, hang on, one more chat coming up. Let me have a look. Do you have any examples of how to integrate the strategies into action? Is a question from Kate.
Well, as I said, the guys at Caring and LVMH have done some of the best work. And then the other ones that I would emphasize is look at all the European banks, the major European banks, because they were, just like so many mining and energy companies, under immense pressure before everybody else. And if you, especially again, in general, as a rule of thumb, Scandinavian companies do a better job than anybody else. And then the French and the Dutch follow suit, and then comes the rest of Europe. So if you look at the Scandinavian banks or at the French banks, in particular BNP Paribas or SEB and Handelsbanken in Sweden, I think they have done really, really good examples of strategy reports, how they develop their strategy and how they put that into action. One company that, as I speak, just pops into my mind that has done a really, really good job is ING Group in the Dutch bank. They have a wonderful strategy report where they show something that I think is always important, is they every year go back to the original strategy plan and then do a comparison with how are we relative to that plan, what have we done in the last year, and if they are falling back behind their targets, they go into an in-depth analysis of what they intend to do the next 1-2 years in order to get back on track. It's a really, really nice way of being held to account. And yeah, I would say look at ING Bank, Handelsbanken, these guys. They tend to do a really good job in that respect.
Great. Thank you. And thank you so much for getting up early and sharing those insights with us. It's just amazing to hear that different perspective in terms of who our audience actually is when we're doing financial reports, and that's the investors or the people who are lending us money. So thank you so much for sharing that, and we hope you have a great day. Off to an early
Thank
start.
you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Cheers.
The climate related risks and opportunities that we looked at in the risk assessment session will likely impact an entity's future performance, and it should be integrated into the entity's strategies, not necessarily just from a climate point of view, but also for a business point of view. An entity is expected to disclose the details of its climate resilience, including how it plans to respond. So, as Joachim pointed out, the what you're going to do about it is very important. And the scenario analysis is the key mechanism through which that climate resilience should be assessed. And it can also uncover business opportunities there. So I think that's it from us, yes, for the strategy session, which means we should be ready for our break.